Hi everyone, my name is Mark Ettensohn. I'm author of the book Unmasking Narcissism, a guide to understanding the narcissist in your life. I'm also a licensed psychologist in the states of California and New York, and I have a private practice with a focus on treating and writing about narcissism and related disorders. You can find a list of my publications and more information about me and my work on my website at www.drettensohn.com. It's my hope that by the end of this presentation, you'll have a new appreciation for narcissism as a mental illness, as opposed to the stigmatized media representations with which we're all familiar, something that I call popular narcissism. So let's get started. The public has a one-dimensional view of narcissism that's been shaped over the last 40 years by popular media representations and by the DSM itself. And for those who may not be familiar with the DSM, that's the official manual used by clinicians in the United States to diagnose mental disorders. The DSM is currently in its 5th revision, called the DSM-5, published in 2013. The popular understanding of narcissism as a disorder of too much self-love goes back at least 30 years. Here's one study from 1991, where researchers asked participants to think about the 3 most narcissistic people they know, and then to describe everyday actions that reflect that person's narcissism. Participants reported everyday narcissistic activities like looking in the mirror, bragging, and putting other people down. Now, for the most part, their descriptions corresponded to narcissistic themes like exhibitionism, grandiosity, and self-centeredness. Basically, the participants echoed what we all probably think of when we think about narcissists. So where do we get these ideas? How do we know what we know about narcissism? Well, those ideas are shaped by the media, which in turn is shaped by our expectations. It's a feedback loop, creating a commonly held picture of what narcissism is. So to demonstrate, here are a few narcissists from popular movies and television shows. See if they line up with your understanding of what narcissism really is. The first is Gaston from Disney's Beauty and the Beast. He's vain, self-absorbed, envious, he's grandiose, aggressive, manipulative, and morally hollow. Next is Miranda Priestly from The Devil Wears Prada. She has low empathy. She's arrogant, cruel, judgmental, shallow, and demeaning or devaluing to other people around her. Gregory House from the TV show House. He has low empathy. He's grandiose, demeaning, and arrogant. Regina George from the movie Mean Girls. She's vain, arrogant, attention-seeking, admiration-seeking, entitled, and cruel. And finally, the Queen from Disney's Snow White. Now, for some reason, Disney is big on narcissistic villains. She's vain, envious, entitled, she needs constant admiration, and she's cruel. Notice that almost all of these characters are villains. And it's not just selection bias. I could have pulled in a number of other characters, and the ratio of villains to heroes really wouldn't change. Walter White, Joffrey Baratheon, Gilderoy Lockhart, even Nate Shelley from Ted Lasso, arguably one of the more realistic portrayals of NPD in popular media, is still a sort of villain. It's simply how we as a culture conceptualize this disorder. In the popular consciousness, narcissists are villains. By and large, they're portrayed as evil, manipulative, scheming, and incredibly into themselves. Lately, the popular literature on narcissism has taken an ugly turn with the rise of narcissistic abuse literature. Here are some titles, and as I go through these, keep in mind that these are supposed to be mental health resources describing a mental illness. First, there's Becoming the Narcissist's Nightmare: How to Devalue and Discard the Narcissist While Supplying Yourself. Now, this book has 4.5 stars on Amazon.com with over 2,000 reviews. It's also one of the top 10 books in the personality disorders category in the Amazon Kindle store. Next, we have How to Kill a Narcissist. Note the inflammatory language used in these titles. They're designed to capture a reader in a certain kind of embattled mindset, in which it feels as though there's a contest for the right to survive and thrive. This is actually a common feeling that individuals experience when they're in a relationship with someone who has borderline or narcissistic personality disorder. However, the answer isn't to fuel that feeling and exploit it for book sales. Such an approach only feeds into a problematic and ultimately dehumanizing perspective. At any rate, like any lurid headline designed to appeal to our most basic survival instincts, books like these sell, even if they keep people trapped in a me versus the narcissist mindset. Next, there's gaslighting, the narcissist's favorite tool of manipulation, which is currently number 2 in the personality disorders category on Amazon. And finally, my personal favorite, exorcism, purging the narcissist from heart and soul. And the cover on this one looks more like a gothic horror novel than a book about mental health. This is where we are at with respect to the popular literature on narcissism. This book, by the way, also has 4.5 stars on Amazon. Now there are, of course, other titles that are less inflammatory and that attempt to help people increase their understanding and compassion for both themselves and the narcissist in their lives, a tone that seems much more befitting the topic of mental health and dealing with mental illness. In the last 10 or so years, popular narcissism has become a legitimate cultural phenomenon. Now these are the current 50 bestsellers in the Amazon.com personality disorders category. Some of the titles I just showed you are sitting on this list. In fact, 19 of the top 50 titles on personality disorders are about narcissism. That's 38%, nearly 4 times the number we would expect if all personality disorders received equal attention. Basically, a lot of people are reading about narcissism, but most of them are reading titles that stigmatize this disorder and portray narcissists as evil villains. And it's not just books. There are an increasing number of YouTube videos and Facebook communities that are dedicated to the narcissist as villain paradigm. Now you might be thinking, okay, so maybe narcissists are getting portrayed as villains. Well, aren't they? I mean, where's the mistake? And if you only went by the DSM-5 description for narcissistic personality disorder, you'd be right. Take a look at the DSM diagnostic criteria for NPD. Grandiosity, entitlement, arrogance, exploitation, lack of empathy. The official description of NPD fits the characters I showed you earlier to a T. But here's the big question. Is this a description of mental illness? Notice there's no mention of suffering, no emotional distress, no internal conflict, only entitlement, manipulation, grandiosity. Truly, this is a person who would be easy to hate. But is this really what narcissism is? In the May 2015 edition of the American Journal of Psychiatry, the authors conclude that the DSM-5 definition of narcissism provides a narrow and homogeneous definition of narcissistic personality disorder, that it doesn't describe the variety of individuals who present with narcissistic issues, and that it completely ignores core features of the disorder like vulnerable self-esteem, feelings of inferiority, emptiness, and perhaps most importantly, distress. And this wasn't the first article in a peer-reviewed journal that pointed out how inadequate the DSM definition of narcissism actually is. People have been writing about this for over 30 years. In fact, when the American Psychiatric Association was writing the DSM-5, they almost threw NPD out altogether because the current diagnostic description is so problematic. They decided to keep it, but they also put together a work group to come up with an alternative description. And here's what they came up with. Their alternative definition starts off by mentioning impairment. So already, we're heads and shoulders above the current criteria that make no mention of impairment, conflict, or distress. They define NPD as impairment across at least 2 of the following 4 areas of personality functioning: identity, self-direction, empathy, and intimacy. For identity, They say that narcissists have an unstable identity based on the reactions of other people, and that their self-esteem bounces around between extremes of high and low. For self-direction, narcissists are stuck chasing other people's approval. They have trouble setting their own goals, and they tend to see themselves through an extreme lens, where they're either exceptional or worthless. It also says that they are often unaware of their own motivations, which sort of kills the idea that narcissists are mustache-twirling villains. For empathy, narcissists have trouble recognizing how other people feel because they tend to be very focused on whether other people approve of them. This leads them to overestimate or underestimate how important they are to other people. Now, on the one hand, that sets the stage for arrogance. But on the other hand, if you chronically underestimate how important you are to other people, it sets the stage for depression. And finally, intimacy. Narcissists have trouble forming deep connections and bonds with other people because they're so focused on their own self-worth. So we've covered how the DSM-5 definition of narcissism is too narrow, how it misses important features of the disorder like vulnerable self-esteem and impairments in distress tolerance, how it fails to address underlying psychological structures that produce symptoms, and how it leaves out any mention of distress. But there's even more. Here are some other problems with the DSM-5 description of NPD. NPD was first added as an official diagnosis to the DSM-3 in 1980. At the time, the diagnosis had a broader, more inclusive criteria that was heavily influenced by psychoanalytic theories concerning narcissism. The American Psychiatric Association removed all reference to dynamic conflict and emotional distress for NPD when they published the revised version of the DSM-3 in 1987, because they thought that the original NPD description was too heavily influenced by psychoanalytic theory. But they were overzealous. They ended up stripping away everything that grounded the disorder as an actual mental illness, and the data support that conclusion. Recent studies have looked at the reliability and validity of the DSM definition of NPD, and they've found that it has low temporal stability, meaning that when you assess someone one day and diagnose them with NPD, they may not meet the same criteria in a month or a year. And that's a big problem when it comes to personality disorders, because they're supposed to be stable over time, meaning they don't easily change. As described in the DSM, NPD is not stable because it is little more than a collection of surface-level traits. It doesn't address underlying psychological structures that produce those traits. NPD also has extremely low prevalence rates. Some studies have found less than 1% of people meet the descriptive criteria for it. It is actually the least diagnosed of all personality disorders. Even though it's overrepresented in popular media and on Amazon, hardly anyone in the real world qualifies for the disorder as it is currently described in the DSM. Finally, it has low clinical utility. As a construct, NPD simply isn't very useful. Narcissists in a grandiose state don't seek treatment. And the DSM makes it impossible to diagnose a narcissist who is not in a grandiose state, something we'll discuss later. As a result, most therapists outside of certain settings like prisons simply do not diagnose people with NPD. So we have a diagnosis that doesn't describe a person who is mentally ill, that doesn't hold up consistently over time, that is exceedingly rare in the general population, and that therapists don't ever use except in very limited settings like prison. How did this happen? Most of what we know about narcissism, we know from research using one instrument, the NPI. The NPI was made using the DSM description for narcissism, and 77% of all research done on narcissism since the 1980s has used it. All versions of the NPI focus only on grandiose narcissism. In other words, the version of narcissism that is exceedingly rare and doesn't include any emotional suffering or distress. Increasingly, researchers agree that the NPI does not actually measure mental illness. Instead, it measures traits that are arguably adaptive in the right settings. Here's a description from the team that developed the test. According to them, the NPI identifies people who are energetic, extroverted, and experience-seeking, grandiose in their conception of themselves, and that others often see them as egotistical and conceited. The NPI, the main instrument used to research narcissism, doesn't describe mental illness. It describes Steve Jobs, or any number of highly successful business leaders. Was Steve Jobs narcissistic? Probably. Did he have a personality disorder? I don't know. Maybe. But he was also an effective leader and a visionary who changed the world. And this is the issue with the NPI, and arguably the last 30-odd years of narcissism research that uses it. NPI scores are rarely associated with other hallmarks of serious mental illness and distress. And that's why we tend to think of narcissists as not really mentally ill. In short, the last 30-odd years of research into narcissism using the NPI may be fatally flawed, which means that we may know next to nothing about narcissism.